order to get him or her back. Do you know? So actually, you're pretty set up as a therapist, because what they want is a rabbit out of a hat, which we don't do. We don't do. Am I making some sense so far? You're with me, Jolly? And I'm sorry I have to look at this, but because I'm doing it for the first time, it does not flow that fluently. Okay. I think the other really important thing to think about with a couple relationship, this is quite difficult. That's halfway, is it? Thanks very much. Is that to hold in mind that actually, you know, we hook up with people who are as distressed as we are, you know, with people who are as capable of intimacy as we are. You know, it's a really important concept. Snow White does not marry the big bad wolf. Okay? Prince Charming does not marry the wicked witch. It's just not like that. Okay? It's a really important thing to hold in mind. You know, and we need to take, in adult couple relationships, 50% of the responsibility for the muddle. Now, around addiction, I think, does a little collusion, which sort of says, look, we're both a bit sort of messed up, but let's make it look like you really messed up. Okay? So you might get it, you know, the financial addictions, they'll come in and him or her is just been spending all the money and look what she's done, or look what he's done, and we've got these debts and I didn't know about it. And actually what you have to do as a couple therapist is to say, okay, so when did you decide, at what point in your marriage did you decide, or in your couple relationship, did you decide that he or she was going to be in charge of the money? Because the extent to which you haven't kept an eye on it is the extent to which, actually, it's got out of control. So actually, they're just really important things. Patrick Carnes, who writes about, who put sex addiction on the map, I mean, he'll say that actually he's never met the partner of a sex addict who doesn't have trauma. I've never met, I don't have the experience that he's had, but I've never met the partner of a sex addict who actually doesn't have a sexual trauma of some kind. Okay? But, you know, it's a pretty good way of not looking at your sexual trauma when your partner's having a big act out, isn't it? I mean, how very nice of them to, you know, to collude in all of this. You know, to raise your game by looking like the problem. So really important to hold this, you know, hold all this stuff in mind. It's a difficult concept for people to, you know, to get. Okay, the other thing is, we know this about addiction. Damaged people put themselves in harm's way. You know, we sort of know that. Damaged people put themselves in harm's way. There is a compulsion to repeat. Freud talked about all of this. There's something about, and I think this is where we start talking about mum and dad, you know, there's something about what we recreate in the ordeal phase of our relationships that is a resonance of what was happening in the childhood relationship. And it's really, really important. And you know, I sit with a lot of people who are talking about, either in couples or individually, talking about how they feel. And I guess I've just really learned to listen. When they tell you about how they feel with a partner, she never makes any space, you know, she doesn't make any space for me. You know, there's no point in me saying how I feel. It's just, everything's just going to kick off. You know, I can't really be myself. I make a point of thinking about that as if this is the child in front of me telling me about what it was like in their family of origin. Because what they're getting is, of course, it's about the here and now, but it becomes a bit of a double whammy. You know, for people, you know, again with this suboptimal parenting, they'll find themselves in situations that are both distressing in the here and now, but also ring a bell from the there and then. So actually, you know, this is really quite sort of overwhelming. And you get all the issues, for those of you, the therapists, you know, in the audience, the issues of transference, the belief that actually, very often, even when people aren't behaving like your mum or your dad, you start to really just see them as they are. And in the ordeal phase, this often manifests as assuming people's intentions are negative. And you hear this, of course, when people are saying, God, I just can't get it right, she says. I'm trying, so I just can't get it right for him. Or vice versa, because actually what's happened in that ordeal phase is that, you know, all the assumptions are that the other's intentions are negative. Okay. Let's talk about, let's just go back to and talk about addiction for a moment. We know about addiction is, what do we know about addiction? It's genetically proposed, it's environmentally disposed. It's about a search for pleasure that continues into an escape from reality. It costs more than we can afford. Okay? It's about self-seeking, it's about destruction, it's anti-intimacy. You know, we know that. All the addictions, and addiction is such a wide thing now, as you know, I said before, with the financial addictions, the sex and love addictions, the work addictions, the food and the eating addictions. I'm very fascinated around the eating. The one that we start to see the most, and actually probably isn't really seen as addiction, is orthorexia, which, as you may know, is the unhealthy obsession with healthy eating, the sort of fatty eating. The people who actually know, I think I can't possibly eat pizza, and I'm going to have to bring my food along with me, and I'm going to count as it's extreme. I might count the almonds that I put on my porridge. You know, the attempt to, and the whole food industry and the diet industry really, and the health industry really feed this, which is, you know, it's worth so much money, that industry. But actually what it's about is trying to manage how I feel inside by controlling the outside. It's not a million miles from anorexia. I will control how I feel by what I put in or don't put into my body. But all these things are anti-intimacy, but they're also anti-relationship, because as human beings, you know, actually we want, human beings, we're group animals. You know, we need to be around other people. You know, we need to be around other people. But if you're in addiction, actually your relationship with your addictive substance or process actually becomes the primary relationship. So we're talking again about, here are people in recovery who actually been having a relationship with a process or a substance, who haven't actually learnt to relate to themselves, let alone start relating to someone else, which is, I guess, is why, you know, so many people talk about not having relationships for a certain period of time, which of course is immensely frustrating to most people, and they all reckon that they're the exception to the rule. And particularly if they're in their 20s, how could we possibly not do it? But, you know, there's a bit of sense in it, isn't there? And we have to treat people compassionately, because you know what, they're going to have relationships, they're just going to do it. But, you know, we need to understand, people need to understand why we're saying it, because actually we do have to get to know ourselves before we can get to know someone else. So let's just go back to, let's go back to mum and dad and think about childhood development. You know, we know, you know, in suboptimal parenting, we know disruptive, bondings with mum have an enormous impact. Reduced serotonin, increased adrenaline, increased cortisol, they start to influence brain development. We know that experience is the chief architect of the brain. We know that we're born with, you know, over 100 billion neurons at birth, just waiting to form connections based on experience. We know that the brain, you know, there isn't really a cortex. You know, back to the brainstem, actually what exists is the bit in, you know, is the brainstem, which regulates sort of like heartbeat and just keeps the whole show on the road. You know, and a sort of limbic system, cortex and all of that isn't there, which is why we talk about a pre-verbal period in development. It's just, you know, a lot of cortex, some of it is there, but a lot of it isn't. So very early on, the experiences, and the human brain, of course, starts working before it's built. It's not like a computer that comes already loaded. You know, it starts working and builds itself. So actually what we've got, you know, with experience, if the experiences, you know, are difficult, actually they're the ones that get built upon and remembered. And particularly, you know, early wounds, which is why I think, you know, I'm fascinated in adoption, because I think these early psychological wounds of relinquishment are so traumatic and, of course, can't be recalled, but actually are always remembered as life-threatening. But the sort of wounds, you know, if mum or dad is an addict, has distress, has mental illness, you know, if there's stuff going on at home, if the adult's needs are put over and above the needs of the child, actually, you know, that starts to have an impact on the child. I mean, we know this. We know the real cradle is the parents' relationship. We do know that. Mary Main, the attachment psychologist, was saying, you know, 75% of the child's emotional well-being is dependent on the mother's ability to tell what she describes as an emotionally coherent story, which means the mother's ability to say, look, this is who I am, this is where I've come from, this is my story, this is how I function. You know, the more the mother is able to do that, the more actually the child will feel well. Not because the mother's telling that story to the child, because these things are picked up. And they're picked up in sort of limbic resonance. You know, just picked up, you know, in the same way that these things are picked up when Robin Skinner did the experiment and said, can you just go around with all these people you don't know and put a hand on someone you feel comfortable with? So much. We know this, don't we? 7% of communication is words. I don't know quite how they work that out, but the point is it's a very small amount of stuff. So you know, the problem is that what develops in these situations is a feeling of, well, what we have is the human infant. Freud talked about His Majesty the baby. Nowadays you'd say probably Her Majesty the baby. But the idea that the human infant, certainly up until double figures, tends to think that whatever's going on is something to do with them. And I've seen this, and I often tell this story about a family that I was seeing. There were 3 daughters, and the family were separating. He was in recovery as an alcoholic, and they were doing a very proper thing, actually, getting together, having a chat about what was happening and telling the children. And towards the end of the session, the 7-year-old child, who'd been pretty silent, said, "Is Daddy leaving because of the way I eat my crisps?" Now, what had happened was that this girl, when Dad was drinking, would eat her crisps. Presumably he had a hangover. It sounded pretty awful to him, and he'd get into a state. So, this is what the human infant, His Majesty the baby, starts to believe. It's something to do with me, because that's the world. It's something to do with me. So this is the beginning of the shame and anxiety that fuel addiction. Everybody has shame and anxiety, by the way. It's just that addicts have it sort of volume 10. They have it in buckets full. Shame, the feeling of, oh, it's my fault, there's something wrong with me, I must be I'm overwhelming, there isn't really space for me, which are exactly the sort of things that you start to hear in the counselling room when they talk about their relationships, by the way. I think I just overwhelm everybody. Or he hasn't got, he or she hasn't got space for me. All those, those sorts of things. There's something wrong with me. And the anxiety that fuels addiction, which is this is just not a safe place. The human infant instinctively knows that without care, they're going to die. They just do. They don't know they know it. It's an unthought known. But without care, I'm going to die. So actually, in situations of real abuse and neglect, it really does feel life-threatening. So there was a real search. So back to this word separateness that I talked about. Actually, being separate for people from suboptimal, parenting, being separate is life-threatening. Hence, the beginning of what I guess we call codependency, an attempt to regulate self through a dependent relationship on another person. What's she doing? Let's just look around. What's he doing? What do you have to do to get along around here? How do I need to change myself? So we start to talk about adaptation. And when we talk about adaptation and codependency, we talk about a loss of self. I want to suggest to you that codependency actually is an addiction to security. It is an addiction to security at all costs, because being separate is life-threatening. Okay, so back to the ordeal phase of relationship, where everything that he or she does is just so wonderful and marvelous. Back to the negotiating, the being separate, the being found attractive. If you can't be separate because it feels life-threatening, you actually can't be attractive. If you can't look after your needs, if you can't take care of your own needs, no adult is actually going to want to have a relationship with you. That's the truth of it. So, actually being in recovery, this is quite complicated, isn't it? Because first of all, in the ideal phase, you think you're taking drugs, and then you've got all this stuff in the ordeal phase where actually it can't really be separate. No wonder it gets no deal. No wonder, it gets to no deal. God, and it's very easy to separate now, let's face it. So actually quite hard to go into, it takes a lot of courage to go into real deal. Am I still making some sense, please? Thank you very much. It's always good to know. Okay. Yeah, maybe just, I don't know, how are we doing? Yeah, we're doing all right, okay. So at its extreme, codependency, you'll know, the authors in the recovery field. Pim Melody writes a lot about it. Bradshaw, Rocco Learn, a lot of people. There's a lot of books. Some a bit easier to read than others, some a bit simplistic and some slightly outdated. But most of them actually, I think, are onto something. I think, though, I'd rather like to have a sort of more because actually the British haven't really sort of contributed much. It's all come from the States, which is a pity, actually. I was at an addiction symposium the other week, the only one we have in the UK, and most of the speakers were American. I love the Americans, but actually, we know quite a bit, don't you think? We know quite a bit. We should be talking, we should be talking about this. And actually,